Introduction. Were the Nazis socialists? Was fascist Italy under Mussolini socialist? Is fascism a left-wing or right-wing ideology? This is the second in two videos addressing these questions. This video covers these topics. 1. Failure of early Nazi socialists. 2. Contemporary commentary on Italian and Nazi capitalism. 3. Was Italian and German fascism right-wing or left-wing? 4. Mussolini and Hitler's rejection of socialism. 5. Counter-arguments answered. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. Failure of early Nazi socialists. Prior to 1932, the Nazi Party included at least some socialist sympathetic members. However, they were ineffective and were soon ignored, expelled, or executed. Gottfried Feder. Gottfried Feder was an anti-capitalist, though not a Marxist. However, historian Albrecht Tyrrell observes Feder completely failed to influence Hitler and the Nazi economic program. Tyrrell writes, quote, Feder's rejection of the Marxist form of anti-capitalism was unmistakable, end quote. He adds, quote, Feder had been neither Hitler's advisor on economic and financial questions, nor had he exercised influence on his political attitude in these matters, end quote. As a further comment, he says that Feder, quote, remained a propagandist and theorist who had failed to commit the NSDAP definitely to his financial and economic program, end quote. Likewise, Professor of Political Science Anush Kokish observes Feder's social programs, quote, were not socialist in the economic sense, end quote. Historian Rainer Zeitelmann also writes of how, quote, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Hitler then gradually withdrew from Feder, whose career came to an end once and for all in August 1934, end quote. Very importantly, he adds, quote, Feder's career reflects the change in Hitler's economic concepts, end quote. If Hitler ever had any pro-socialist sympathies, his rejection of Feder's program and his marginalization of Feder in the Nazi Party demonstrates that later he abandoned those ideas. Similarly, Nazi leader Albert Krebs wrote that Hitler, quote, completely ignored the somewhat cranky ideas of Feder and gave Feder no role in the Third Reich, end quote. This is echoed by historian Harold Gordon, who notes, quote, Feder was alternately tolerated and ignored, end quote. Ferdinand Zimmermann. Ferdinand Zimmermann was originally a social conservative and anti-capitalist, writing under the pen name Ferdinand Fried. However, historian Hermann Lebowitz writes that, quote, like the Nazis, Fried abandoned the ideology of social conservatism, end quote, and, quote, gave up his offensive against capitalism, end quote. Gregor Strasser. Gregor Strasser was a Nazi official who originally proposed nationalizing the economy. However, historian Peter Statura writes that over time, Strasser, quote, became less and less a socialist and more of what might be termed a social conservative, end quote. Professor of philosophy Scott Sehon notes that, quote, whatever left-leaning ideas he had were, by the late 1920s, thoroughly rejected by Hitler, end quote, and observes that in 1934, both Strasser and all the members of the party who agreed with him were put to death. Contemporary commentary on Italian and Nazi capitalism. During the era of the Italian and German fascist regimes, the overwhelming majority of political analysts, historians, sociologists, economists, and other scholars across various disciplines in a range of different countries repeatedly drew the conclusion that both the Italian and German forms of fascism were capitalist. The fact that this conclusion was drawn by the vast majority of scholars does not prove it is correct. A scholarly consensus is not valuable simply by virtue of its numbers. Rather, it is valuable due to the way it is formed. When the overwhelming majority of scholars across a wide range of academic disciplines, representing a broad spectrum of conflicting political views, comes to an agreement on a matter as a result of repeatedly reading and critiquing each other's analysis of historical events, using and applying the same definitions consistently, we can be certain that this is not a fringe belief resulting from the personal or political bias of a handful of people. In contrast, when only a minority of scholars oppose a particular viewpoint, and almost all of those scholars hold personal beliefs which are antagonistic to that viewpoint, we may reasonably draw the conclusion that their opposition is motivated less by facts than by personal preference. Additionally, when scholars apply the same definitions of capitalism and socialism to every country, we can be sure they are being consistent, whereas when scholars apply certain definitions of capitalism and socialism to fascist Italy and Germany, but not to all other countries, we may legitimately charge them with being inconsistent and question their motives for doing so. So let's review 20 years of scholarly commentary on the fascist economies of Italy and Germany from 1926 to 1946. We'll find that regardless of personal ideology, both capitalist and Marxist scholars typically identify the fascist economies as some form of capitalism rather than socialism, consistently using the same definitions of capitalism as socialism, and that they were identified as socialist typically only by libertarians and members of the Austrian school, a model of radical economic individualism, who tended to use different definitions of capitalism and socialism and apply them inconsistently. A 1926 article in the American journal Current History and Forum quoted Mussolini stating, quote, "We must accustom ourselves to think that this capitalist system, with all its virtues and defects, will continue to rule the world for centuries," end quote, and declaring explicitly, quote, "Capitalism has a future of which fascismo," that is, fascism, "recognizes and approves," end quote. The same article also quoted Mussolini stating, quote, "If you want to live, you must face the serious problem of this century, that of the relations between capital and labor, the problem which fascism has solved by placing capital and labor on the same level," end quote. In 1927, a report by the United States World War Foreign Debt Commission observed that in Mussolini's fascist Italy, the capitalist elites, which it described as a plutocracy, quote, "works hand in hand with the court party to sustain the fascist sway," end quote. The report noted that, quote, "Capitalism in Italy has a character and constitution peculiar to that country," end quote, and that the capitalist elite, quote, "finances the fascist party and the fascist press," end quote, such that it, quote, "receives privileges which consolidate its own position," end quote. The astute observation that under fascist regimes, capitalists submitted to operating under certain restrictions while receiving certain privileges in order to maintain their position of authority in the economy has been noted by many commentators on fascist economies over many decades. In his book, The Nazi Dictatorship, published in 1932, Cambridge scholar Roy Pascal explained that although earlier on some members of the Nazi Party had anti-capitalist tendencies, quote, "this anti-capitalistic theory was completely abandoned once Hitler came to power and has played no part in the fashioning of present-day Germany," end quote. In her 1934 article, International Socialism, The End of an Era, Helen Byrne Armstrong contrasted, quote, "the extremes of the modern world, the system of the Soviet Union on the one hand, and the state capitalism of Italy and Germany on the other," end quote. This identification of fascist Italy and fascist Germany as state capitalist was typical of the time. In 1934, American Democrat William Sirovich gave a speech to the New York House of Representatives in which he not only condemned communism and socialism, but also condemned Nazism. In the process, he also gave his assessment of the Nazi economy, writing, quote, "State capitalism, instead of private corporate capitalism, finds its greatest expression and operation today in Germany," end quote. Sirovich, despite being opposed to both socialism and communism, clearly identified the fascist economy of Nazi Germany as state capitalism. In 1935, historian Carmen Hader, considered an expert on Italian fascism, wrote, quote, "Fascism is the defender of a declining capitalism," end quote. Hader was not a Marxist, though she was concerned about the potential for big business and laissez-faire capitalism to breed fascism in the US, a concern shared by other economists and political scientists at the time, as well as by some leading US capitalists. In 1935, social anthropologist Robert Briffault identified fascism as explicitly capitalist, warning of the danger of, quote, an attack of the fascist capitalist world against the Soviet Union, end quote, which he said would require, quote, the defense of human life and human values against the attacks of fascist capitalism, end quote. A 1935 article by Hungarian professor Alexander Kristic, who actually opposed communism, explained that the clearest difference between fascism and socialism, quote, is the fact that fascism is based on private property, while socialism is based on public property, end quote. He went on to write that socialism, quote, does not permit any revenue from capital or earned profits, end quote, and, quote, permits only public ownership as the source of general prosperity, end quote. Kristic described Italian and German fascism as, quote, private and public ownership existing alongside of each other, end quote, contrasting it with socialism, which he said was, quote, based upon public ownership exclusively, end quote. In a 1935 article, American economist John R. Commons, who was a social reformer but not a Marxist, expressed his belief that although Marx didn't know the words fascism and Nazism, quote, he used equivalent words such as monopoly capitalism or state capitalism, end quote. In Commons' view, fascism was nothing like socialism, but just a form of capitalism concentrated in monopoly of private corporations enabled by the state. Similar to Carmen Hader, Commons believed that these monopolistic companies, quote, are the legal foundations of what ultimately becomes fascism or state capitalism. A 1935 article by political scientist Charles W. Pipkin described how the coercive power of the state was used to maintain capitalist class relations. Citing English economist Harold Lasky, Pipkin observed that these capitalist class relations had, quote, never been challenged in the system of fascism, either by Hitler in Germany or by Mussolini in Italy, end quote. A 1936 article by American political scientist Albert Lepowski noted astutely, quote, of the two major planks of the National Socialist program, nationalism and socialism, the trend of events in Germany today emphasizes nationalism and not socialism, end quote. Journalist John Gunther's 1936 book, Inside Europe, noted that, quote, fascism as Mussolini introduced it was not probably a deliberate artifice for propping up the capitalist structure, but it has had that effect, end quote, observing that capitalists under fascist Italy had traded certain privileges to the state in exchange for better control of their workers. Importantly, Gunther described Italian fascism as the opposite of Russian socialism, writing, quote, the whole color and tempo of the fascist revolution, in contrast to that in Russia, is backward, end quote. In 1936, an article in the American left-leaning journal The Modern Monthly defended US President Theodore Roosevelt against claims by communists that he was a fascist. The article contrasted Roosevelt's support for the working class with fascism's support for capitalists, arguing that fascism, quote, has one purpose to perform, to save capitalism by putting down the working class when the latter threatens to destroy it, end quote. The same article acknowledged that, quote, capitalists never like fascism, end quote, and that they, quote, accept fascist capitalism with the greatest of reluctance, and then only because they have no alternative, end quote. However, it also noted that capitalist objections to fascism were not because it was anti-capitalist, but because, quote, fascist capitalism, leading as it must eventually do towards state capitalism, puts too much power into the hands of the state, end quote. In 1936, Marxist economist Nikolai Bukharin wrote, quote, the Italian fascists claim there is no capitalism in Italy, but a special kind of order which is neither capitalism nor socialism, end quote, and said that Hitler and his followers, quote, declare that in their country they have National Socialism, end quote. However, he observed that in both Italy and Germany, the capitalist class continued to exist, and that both Mussolini and Hitler had left the capitalist oligarchs in their positions, the complete opposite of socialism. In 1937, German political scientist and liberal Democrat Karl Lowenstein argued that when private capitalism is threatened, it uses fascism, quote, as a protective wall of counter-revolution, end quote. He added, quote, beyond doubt, this theory is justified empirically by events in Germany, Italy, Austria, and recently in Spain, end quote. In 1937, propaganda analyst Clyde R. Miller wrote, quote, fascism has as an underlying economic purpose the preservation of capitalism and the prevention of socialism, end quote, and noted, quote, to prevent even the discussion of socialism or communism, all democratic liberties are destroyed, end quote. German economist Gunter Riemann's 1939 book, The Vampire Economy, described in detail how the Nazi regime maintained capitalism, writing, quote, the state refuses to become the owner of industrial or distribution enterprises. It prefers to leave the difficulties of production to the private entrepreneur, end quote. Although he acknowledged that the Nazi regime placed capitalists at the mercy of the state's will by denying them an inviolable right to property, Riemann insisted, quote, this Nazi doctrine has nothing to do with communism or socialism, end quote, but rather, quote, as a new justification for the state's use of private capital, end quote. Riemann also wrote that although, quote, capitalists may feel that they are mere agents of a state which is building up a new anti-capitalist society, end quote, in reality, quote, it is easy to prove that fascism relies on capitalist economy, end quote, despite the occasional restrictions of the state. Importantly, he noted that visible conflict between Italian and German capitalists and their respective states, quote, is in itself proof that private property and the search for profit have not ceased to exist under fascism, end quote. In Riemann's view, quote, the fascist regime rests on two pillars, the absolute power of the state and the power of private property holders whose property rights are protected by and are dependent on the state, end quote. A 1940 article by American political scientist Ralph Bunche argued that, quote, Nazi fascism substitutes for private capitalism or socialism a powerful planned state economy, end quote, adding, quote, it is not socialism that is found in fascist Germany and Italy, nor yet state capitalism, end quote. Although he did not view the fascist economies as state capitalist, he nevertheless explicitly denied they were socialist. In 1941, ex-Marxist Louis Freiner, who had become completely disillusioned by communism due to Stalin's totalitarian behavior, wrote the article Monopoly and the Corporate State under the pen name Louis Corey. In this article, he observed that totalitarianism was not only found in communist Russia, but also, quote, in fascist Germany and Italy, where capitalist ownership is still allowed, by and large, but is deprived of all functional control over industry, end quote. Note that Corey acknowledged capitalist ownership was present in both the German and Italian fascist economies, though he argued the capitalists had no control over the industry. In 1941, Frederick Pollock, a neo-Marxist social scientist, defined Nazi Germany's economy as totalitarian state capitalism, a view with which mainstream modern economists and historians agree. In 1942, the Marxist political scientist Franz Neumann defined the German fascist economy as, quote, a private capitalistic economy regimented by the totalitarian state, end quote. In 1944, political scientist Louis Wassermann drew a sharp distinction between socialism and fascism, writing, quote, fascism has launched its attacks upon the whole apparatus of socialism, end quote, adding, quote, to the fascist, the state is emphatically not what Marx believed, end quote. Commenting on fascist economies, he argued, quote, the fascist economy in Italy attempted to establish a working compromise between private capitalism and the requirements of the totalitarian state, end quote. Further writing, quote, private enterprise was encouraged and protected, end quote. A 1944 report by the US Military Academy entitled The Governments of the Major Foreign Powers observed, quote, originally anti-capitalistic, Mussolini as a fascist grew tolerant of capitalism and drew support from some of its leaders, end quote. In 1944, the economists Otto Nathan and Milton Fried identified the Nazi economy as, quote, a capitalist economy in which the institutions of private property and private profit were modified but not abandoned, end quote. They argued that this was, quote, not capitalism in the traditional sense, end quote, pointing to the lack of a free market, and also argued, quote, it was not state capitalism, end quote. Nevertheless, they insisted, quote, it was not socialism or communism. Private property and private profit still existed, end quote. Instead concluding, quote, the Nazi system was, rather, a combination of some of the characteristics of capitalism and a highly planned economy, end quote. In a 1946 review of Nathan and Fried's book, economist Arthur Schweitzer agreed with their overall case, but believed their description of Nazi economic control was overstated, objecting particularly to their suggestion that, quote, in every essential respect, the Nazi control of business is total, end quote. Instead, Schweitzer observed, quote, the writer is unable to explain the most typical fact of a fascist economy, namely the coexistence of private ownership of property and control of business, end quote. Although Schweitzer argued, quote, the Nazis destroyed the four basic freedoms of private capitalism, end quote, he also insisted this nevertheless resulted in, quote, a division of the economy into private and public spheres, end quote. Further arguing, quote, all attempts to deprive big business completely of economic power failed, end quote. Like others, Schweitzer believed the Nazis had, quote, established a new type of economic order, end quote. Also, like others, Schweitzer argued this economic system, quote, can best be described as state capitalism, end quote. Was Italian and German fascism left or right wing? Both Mussolini and Hitler identified fascism as right wing. Mussolini wrote explicitly, quote, but fascism, which sits on the right and is reactionary towards socialism, is revolutionary instead towards the liberal state and liberalism, end quote. Contemporaries of Mussolini identified fascism as right wing. A 1940 article in the Dublin Review identified fascism as the opposite of Marxism, writing, quote, Marxism on the one hand and fascism and Nazism on the other, end quote. In his early days, Hitler attempted to represent himself in a central position between the left and right in order to try and gain as much support as possible. Rainer Zeitelmann quotes Hitler saying that his party, quote, was not fighting against the right or left, but was taking what was valuable from both sides, end quote. Zeitelmann says, quote, Hitler regarded only the truly extreme forces, the idealists of the extreme right and extreme left, as being suitable for the new movement, end quote. He also quotes Hitler saying, quote, our movement must comprise both extremes, left and right, end quote. However, sometimes Hitler was far more clear about where he personally really positioned himself. In a 1922 speech, Hitler said Germany faced two choices, quote, either the left, end quote, which he identified as Bolshevism, that is, socialism and communism, or, quote, a party of the right, end quote, which he identified as his own party, quote, the beginning of resistance of which I spoke a few minutes ago, end quote. Rainer Zeitelmann also acknowledges that, quote, Hitler did not proceed against the left in the same way as he did against the right, end quote, explaining that Hitler was far more antagonistic towards the left than he was to even his right-wing opponents. Although describing some of Hitler's opposition to the right, Zeitelmann also writes, quote, it is incontestable that the communists and the social democrats had to bear the greater sacrifices, end quote, adding, quote, while they were being tortured and murdered in the concentration camps, the right-wing bourgeois and the capitalist forces were still making good money in the Third Reich, end quote. So Zeitelmann, despite the fact that he wants to argue Hitler had some left-leaning tendencies, still has to acknowledge that Hitler persecuted the left almost exclusively and to a far greater extent than he ever antagonized the right. Additionally, it is significant that he acknowledges that while Hitler's left-wing opponents were being persecuted and tortured, the right-wing capitalists were happily still making what Zeitelmann calls good money. This makes it clear where Hitler's sympathies really lay. Zeitelmann still tries to rescue some of Hitler's antagonism towards the right Quoting Hitler's words in 1945, quote, "We liquidated the left-wing class fighters, but unfortunately we forgot in the meantime to also launch the blow against the right. That is our great sin of omission," end quote. However, even here, Hitler is only speaking of his right-wing opponents. He isn't talking about opposing right-wing ideology itself. In 1925, the International Federation of Textile Workers Associations identified the Nazis as right-wing, stating, quote, "There are now parties on the right wing who are called National Socialists," end quote. We might consider this an obviously biased perspective, given the fact that the International Federation of Textile Workers Associations was at least left-leaning, if not explicitly leftist. However, this view was shared by many of Hitler's contemporaries right across the political spectrum, even when it was inconvenient for them to do so. In 1928, the Foreign Policy Association Information Service, an American non-profit group, reported on the recent German elections saying, quote, "The parties of the extreme right are now 2 in number. The National Socialist Workers' Party," that is, the Nazis, "and the German People's Freedom Movement," end quote, thus identifying the Nazis, the National Socialists, as not just on the right, but the extreme right. In May 1930, Otto Strasser, a member of the Nazi Party who wanted the Nazis to be genuinely Marxist socialists, confronted Hitler with the fact that the Nazis were, in fact, becoming increasingly pro-capitalist and anti-Marxist. A point of contention between Strasser and Hitler was that Hitler objected to the pro-socialist commentary produced by the Kampfverlag, a publishing company owned by the Nazi Party and run by the pro-socialist Nazis Gregor and Otto Strasser. In a face-to-face conversation, Otto Strasser told Hitler that his desire to suppress the Kampfverlag, quote, "only serves to emphasize the profound difference in our revolutionary and socialist ideas," end quote. Strasser also identified explicitly the fact that he knew Hitler's stated aims for objecting to Kampfverlag articles were not genuine, telling Hitler, quote, "The reasons you give for destroying the Kampfverlag I take to be only pretexts," end quote. Instead, Strasser rightly said, quote, "The real reason is that you want to strangle the social revolution for the sake of legality and your new collaboration with the bourgeois parties of the right," end quote. Thus, even in 1930, a genuinely pro-socialist member of the Nazi Party had told Hitler to his face that he knew Hitler was not a real socialist and that Hitler was deliberately collaborating with right-wing capitalists. In 1930, the English-Speaking Union, an educational charity founded in Britain, stated explicitly, quote, "The Nazis, National Socialists, or Fascists, represent the extreme right wing," end quote. In 1931, an article in the mainstream American fashion and society magazine Vanity Fair stated that Hitler had gained power by splitting the left wing of German politics and by appealing to the right wing, writing, quote, "The right wing, nationalist, fascist, etc., votes he wooed by promising agricultural relief for East Germany," end quote. Note here the explicit identification of fascism with the right wing. In 1932, an article in the periodical Arnold Foundation Studies in Public Affairs commented on the recent German elections, saying, quote, "The only political parties in the Reich which gained power between 1929 and 1933 were the Nazis on the extreme right and the communists on the extreme left," end quote. Note how the Nazis are identified as on the extreme right, in complete opposition to the communists, who are identified as on the extreme left. Also in 1931, a publication by the Institute of World Affairs, a non-government organization seeking peaceful resolution to political conflicts, referred to, quote, "the extreme right, which was led by Hitler and Hugenberg," end quote. In 1934, journalist Michael Frey published the book Hitler's Wonderland, documenting his experiences in Nazi Germany to that date. Describing Germany's political parties in the early 1930s, he wrote, quote, "Finally, on the extreme right sat the National Socialist Party," end quote. That is, the Nazis. In 1939, an article in the journal Danubian Review, published in Budapest by Pesti Hörlap, a Hungarian daily newspaper, commented on recent political events in Germany, referring to, quote, "the extreme right, the National Socialists," end quote. That is, the Nazis. Also in 1939, German journalist Edgar Stern-Rubath explicitly identified the Nazis as right-wing, writing, quote, "Both the right-wing parties, the German nationalists and the National Socialists, end quote. This large cross-section of historical documents from 1922 to 1939 shows that during the time the Italian and German fascist governments were in power, even before the war, not only did Mussolini and Hitler themselves identify their parties as right-wing, but so did their contemporaries. Regardless of political persuasion, commentators across Europe and in the US consistently understood the fascists to be both right-wing, even extreme right-wing, and the direct opposites of the left-wing. Consequently, commentators today who say the fascists were right-wing are not historical revisionists or introducing some new idea to insulate leftism from association with fascism. They are simply repeating what everybody at the time already knew and agreed. The Italian fascists and the German fascists were right-wing. The Nazis in particular were described repeatedly by their contemporaries as extreme right. Mussolini and Hitler's rejection of socialism. Both Mussolini and Hitler explicitly rejected socialism. Social scientist Herbert Levine says, quote, although Mussolini began his life as a socialist, he had rejected socialism by 1914, end quote. Professor of Education Benjamin Welsh likewise writes, quote, Mussolini rejected socialism, embraced nationalism, and strong-armed his way into power in 1922, end quote. Importantly, Mussolini's early abandonment of socialism was recognized and well documented by his contemporaries. A 1926 article in the American journal The Nation records, quote, probably the secret of Mussolini's lapse from socialism lies in his distrust of internationalism, end quote. Even earlier, a 1923 article in the American trade journal Printers Inc. reported on a conversation with Mussolini in which, quote, my friend asked the question of the Italian statesman as to why Mussolini had ceased to be a socialist, end quote. The article's author quoted Mussolini answering the question by saying, quote, my observations during the war showed me that socialism was not constructive, that dependence upon the initiative and enterprise of the state was placing one's faith in sterility and inertia, end quote. The author further quoted Mussolini saying, quote, I then studied what was going on in Russia, and I found there that in the logical development of socialism and dependence upon the state, everything led to a complete breakdown of society, end quote. This report makes it very clear that, as early as 1923, Mussolini was already widely understood to have abandoned socialism completely and explicitly opposed it. In his 1933 article, The Political and Social Doctrine of Fascism, Mussolini himself wrote of, quote, the fascist negation of socialism, democracy, and liberalism, end quote. He also said fascism was, quote, the complete opposite of that doctrine, the base of the so-called scientific and Marxist socialism, the materialist conception of history, end quote. Hitler likewise expressed his explicit opposition to socialism. Political scientist Ken Post quotes Hitler writing, quote, there is only one possible kind of revolution, and it is not economic or political or social, but racial, end quote. In 1936, an American newspaper article entitled Hitler Supports Capitalism stated explicitly, quote, Germany will guard jealously the principle of private enterprise in business, Chancellor Adolf Hitler asserted today, end quote, and said, quote, the Nazi dictator denied that his plans for the future of the nation included marshalling all industrial establishments under governmental control, end quote. This was Hitler's declared opposition to the nationalization of industry. The article also quoted Hitler expressing his complete support for market competition, saying, quote, I am convinced there must be competition to bring the best to the top, end quote, and opposing nationalism, which he said would cause workers to lose interest in their jobs. Hitler was also quoted saying, quote, great improvement in manufacturing processes springs from keen rivalry between competitors, end quote, making it clear he intended to preserve competition between private capitalists in the market. When asked, quote, but does not socialist economy presuppose restriction of private enterprise, end quote, Hitler replied, quote, of course, whenever private interests clash with the interests of the nation, the good of the community must come before profits to the individual. But that still leaves abundant room for private enterprise, end quote. So whatever Hitler meant by his socialism, it was certainly not the socialism which abolishes capitalism. It was a system which would retain capitalism and encourage competition between private enterprises. Contemporaries of Mussolini and Hitler also understood that both men completely opposed socialism, but also understood that they drew their support specifically from capitalists who sought protection from socialists and communists. In 1934, scholar Lindsay Rogers wrote, quote, "In a sense, both fascism and the National Socialist movement in Germany sought to annihilate the left, or at least to draw its fangs. In neither country, however, was it the purpose of the new regime to put the old order back into power, that is, to re-establish the traditional right." End quote. However, he also added, quote, "The Nazis were helped by the great industrialists, but they promptly began to attempt to free themselves from this support. Both movements were hostile to socialism and were willing to accept any allies in the fight against socialism." End quote. In 1938, scholars Frederick Blackley and Miriam Oatman observed how capitalists were financially supporting the Nazi Party, writing, quote, "Donations were being given by German businessmen who were well assured that National Socialism was somewhat of a guarantee against socialism." End quote. In 1938, political analysts Raymond Buell and Eugene Chase wrote that capitalist magnates in Germany, quote, "regarded the Nazis as the best bulwark against socialism and communism, despite the vague socialistic theories of the Hitlerites, which they did not take seriously." End quote. In 1939, sociologist Eva Ross similarly wrote that Hitler's so-called socialism, quote, "has nothing in common with socialism, if by socialism is meant the abolition of capital, since it was founded to protect capitalism against socialism and communism." End quote. In 1939, economist W.G.J. Knopp likewise wrote, quote, "A large number of German capitalists supported Herr Hitler's movement because they saw in it a safeguard against socialism and Bolshevism." End quote. In 1940, American economist Earl Sykes likewise wrote that small business owners thought Hitler would protect them, quote, "against both giant business organizations and against socialism or communism, which they feared would confiscate their small businesses." End quote. Mainstream scholarship agrees that both the Italian and German fascists were not socialists and opposed all forms of socialism. Historical biographer Jasper Ridley wrote, quote, "Fascism likewise rejected socialism," end quote, adding, quote, "and fascism rejected Marx's doctrine of historical materialism," end quote. Historian J.R. McNeill similarly writes, quote, "Fascism repudiated democratic politics, vehemently rejected socialism," end quote. Political scientist Gregory Lubert wrote, quote, "Fascism was, above all, a reaction against socialism," end quote. Commenting on Hitler's so-called socialism, historian Israel Gutman wrote, quote, "This social side, however, was of short duration. Hitler opposed socialism, national or otherwise, and his declared belief in it was no more than rhetoric," end quote. Political analyst Ehud Sprinzak likewise wrote, quote, "The fascists despised parliamentary democracy just as they rejected socialism and communism," end quote. Counter-arguments answered. In this section, I'll address the four most common arguments used to defend the proposition that the Italian and German fascists were true socialists. Argument 1. Definitions of capitalism and socialism. The first place people usually start when attempting to claim the Italian and German fascists were socialists is by arguing using their own preferred definitions of capitalism and socialism. In particular, they tend to define capitalism as a completely free market system in which the government has no involvement in the economy, and socialism as any system in which the government has some kind of involvement in the economy. However, these are not accurate definitions of these terms. I have already demonstrated how socialists and capitalists, both past and present, have overwhelmingly used the same definitions of these terms. See the video description for a link to the relevant section of the previous video. Argument 2. Mussolini and Hitler claimed to be socialists. Various quotations from Mussolini and Hitler are occasionally represented as proving they were socialists. These statements typically date to the earlier stages of their political careers, in Mussolini's case when he was a genuine socialist, and in Hitler's case when he was still attempting to attract the socialist movement in German politics in order to gain support for his own non-socialist aims. I have already addressed these changes in the previous video. See the video description for a link to the relevant section. See also the section Failure of Early Nazi Socialists in this video. One of the most widely quoted statements from Mussolini is, quote, "For this I have been and am a socialist. The accusation of inconsistency has no foundation," end quote. This statement was made in an interview with Mussolini near the end of his life and appears to be conclusive evidence that Mussolini always considered himself a socialist and always aimed to build a socialist economy. However, even in this quotation, he explained clearly that what he meant by socialism was nothing like the standard definition, stating, quote, "The only feasible socialism is corporatism," end quote. Corporatism is a social ideology rather than an economic system and is clearly compatible with capitalism, typically coexisting with it, preserving private property and private capitalism, and often supporting capitalists through the state, at which point it becomes a form of state capitalism. As the previous video already demonstrated, the Italian economy under Mussolini's fascism was explicitly state capitalist. We have also seen how Mussolini himself explicitly rejected socialism during the First World War. After this, his position was nationalist and directly antagonistic to socialism. In 1919, Mussolini stated, quote, "We declare war against socialism, not because it is socialism, but because it has opposed nationalism," end quote, and described his desire to, quote, "attract the proletariat away from the official Socialist Party," end quote. He also explained that when it came to the economy, quote, "We favor national syndicalism and reject state intervention whenever it aims at throttling the creation of wealth," end quote. That's a statement which is completely opposed to socialism. It's the declared intention to avoid state intervention unless necessary to generate capitalist profits. In 1921, Mussolini again declared his support for capitalism, stating, quote, "The real history of capitalism is only now beginning, because capitalism is not just a system of oppression, it also represents a choice of values, a coordination of hierarchies, a more amply developed sense of individual responsibility," end quote. He added that this was so obviously true that Lenin himself, though a communist, had been forced to return to at least some form of capitalism, citing Lenin's so-called new economic policy, which revived capitalist elements of the Russian economy under a kind of state capitalism in order to develop the economy. Mussolini took advantage of this to mock Lenin's Marxist socialism and communism, saying scornfully, quote, "Having suppressed the bourgeois physically, he is today begging them to come back, because without capitalism and its technical systems of production, Russia can never get back on her feet again," end quote. In 1935, Mussolini rejected the idea of a liberal economy, noting, quote, "3/4 of the Italian industrial and agricultural economy is in the hands of the state," end quote. At this point, he observed, quote, "And if I dare to introduce to Italy state capitalism or state socialism, which is the reverse side of the medal, I will have the necessary subjective and objective conditions to do it," end quote. The fact that Mussolini differentiated between state capitalism and state socialism, and called state socialism the reverse of state capitalism, indicates he was very well aware of the distinction between the two systems and did not equate them, contrary to many libertarian economists today. As we saw in the previous video, Mussolini opted for state capitalism instead of state socialism. As historian Charles Delzo wrote, quote, "Thus state capitalism was encouraged by fascism," end quote. As with Mussolini, a quotation from Hitler has been used to claim he was a socialist. Conveniently for those making this argument, Hitler said explicitly, quote, "I am a socialist," end quote. However, as convincing as this may sound, the context of this statement is typically ignored. First of all, it must be understood that this statement was made in 1930 during a conversation between Hitler and Otto Strasser, who was a genuinely pro-socialist member of the Nazi Party. Rainer Zeitelmann has claimed Strasser's record of this conversation is, quote, "unreliable on many points," end quote, though he does not explain which points, nor present any evidence. But even he says Strasser is to be believed, quote, when he states that Hitler rejected a general expropriation, end quote, and also accepts Strasser is right when he speaks of Hitler's opposition to nationalism, his rejection of the abolition of capitalism, and his rejection of providing workers with co-ownership in the companies for which they worked. Secondly, it must be understood that Hitler's actual statement was, quote, "I am a socialist and a very different kind of socialist from your rich friend Reventlow," end quote. Hitler was not using this statement to agree with Strasser's pro-socialist policy. He was using it to explain to Strasser why he opposed Strasser's socialism. Hitler was saying explicitly that he was not the same kind of socialist as Strasser. This is explicit from Hitler's own words in the same conversation. He went on to tell Strasser, quote, "Your kind of socialism is nothing but Marxism," end quote, rejecting completely Strasser's pro-socialist vision. Strasser was horrified, writing in his memoir, quote, "I was dumbfounded at these words and told Hitler so openly," end quote, adding that he also told Hitler his ideas were, quote, "a flagrant contradiction of the great mission of National Socialism," end quote. This is significant since it shows that to Strasser, the original National Socialism of the Nazi Party was supposed to be Marxist socialism, and that Hitler was now departing from this left-wing position. To be totally clear, Strasser posed a question to Hitler, asking what he would do about industrial capitalists such as the Krupp Armaments Company. This exchange is worth quoting in full. Strasser asked Hitler, quote, "Let us assume, Herr Hitler, that you came into power tomorrow. What would you do about Krupps? Would you leave it alone or not?" End quote. To which Hitler replied, quote, "Of course I should leave it alone. Do you think me crazy enough to ruin Germany's great industry?" End quote. This, again, was Hitler's explicit rejection of socialism and his explicit support for preserving private property and private capitalism. Strasser then came straight to the point, saying, quote, "If you wish to preserve the capitalist regime, Herr Hitler, you have no right to talk of socialism," end quote. So, as early as 1930, an actual pro-socialist member of the Nazi Party was telling Hitler to his face that if he wanted to preserve capitalism, then he had no right to talk of socialism. This is indisputable proof that the definition of socialism used in Hitler's era by actual socialists themselves necessarily included the abolition of capitalism. Strasser then reminded Hitler that he had come to power on the back of a program which promised actual socialist reforms, stating, quote, "Our supporters are socialists, and your program demands the socialization of private enterprise," end quote. Of course, as we have seen in the previous video, the Nazis never followed through on that program, and this was one of the points at which the pro-socialists in the Nazi Party were starting to realize this. For more information, see the video description for a link to the part of my previous video which addressed this topic in detail. According to Strasser, Hitler responded, quote, "That word socialism is the trouble," end quote, suggesting Hitler realized his political party was encumbered with a term the meaning of which the party itself did not actually support. This is made totally clear from Hitler's next words, in which he declared explicitly that he had never really promised true socialism after all, saying, quote, "I have never said that all enterprises should be socialized," end quote. He reminded Strasser, quote, "On the contrary, I have maintained that we might socialize enterprises prejudicial to the interests of the nation. Unless they were so guilty, I should consider it a crime to destroy essential elements in our economic life," end quote. This is exactly what I said in my previous video, that the Nazis' expropriation and takeover of private capital was not absolute and was limited strictly to those private capitalists who opposed the party or broke the law. Private property was not abolished and private capitalism was preserved. See the video description for a link to that section in the previous video. Strasser also understood this and confronted Hitler with what he saw as the real problem of Hitler's economic program, saying, quote, "But under fascism, the problem of labor and capital remains unsolved. It has not even been tackled. It has merely been temporarily stifled. Capitalism has remained intact, just as you yourself propose to leave it intact," end quote. So it is totally clear that the pro-socialist Strasser understood Hitler's plan for the German economy would preserve private property and private capitalism. Although somewhat restricted, capitalism would remain intact. At this point, Hitler apparently became frustrated with Strasser, whose pro-socialist idealism clearly irritated him. According to Strasser, Hitler said, quote, "There is only one economic system, and that is responsibility and authority on the part of directors and executives," end quote, adding, quote, "Herr Amann asks his office manager to be responsible for his typists and to exercise his authority over them, and so on to the lowest rung of the ladder. That is how it has been for thousands of years, and that is how it will always be," end quote. This was an explicit acknowledgement of the fact that Hitler fully intended the capitalist hierarchy to be preserved. There would be no revolutionary socialism. Strasser continued his futile attempts to talk Hitler around, objecting that the system Hitler was proposing would keep workers at the mercy of their capitalist employers, reminding him that, quote, "It was possible a few years ago for a handful of men not appreciably different from the average to throw 250,000 Ruhr workers on the streets," end quote, and adding, quote, "If this act was legal and in conformity with the morality of our economic system, then the system is criminal," end quote. According to Strasser, Hitler was completely unmoved by this and was, quote, "showing signs of acute impatience," end quote. In response to the prospect of workers being at the mercy of their employers, Hitler responded, quote, "That is no reason for granting the workers a share in the profits of the enterprises that employ them, and more particularly for giving them the right to be consulted," end quote. Again, Hitler was stating explicitly his rejection of socialism, explicitly denying the workers should have even a share in the profits of the companies for which they worked, still less owning the companies themselves. Argument 3. Hitler's socialism wasn't Marxist, but was still socialism. When confronted with the proof that Hitler rejected Marxism, opposed socialism, and preserved capitalism, some people acknowledged that Hitler didn't argue for, or even attempt to implement, socialism in the sense of collectivizing the means of production, placing ownership of the means of production in the hands of the workers, and abolishing capitalism. Instead, they argue he still wanted a kind of socialism, but it was a non-Marxist kind. Attempts to make this argument typically appeal to statements in which Hitler differentiated between socialism as he understood it and socialism as understood by Marx. As we have seen previously, in 1930, Hitler told Otto Strasser, a pro-socialist member of the Nazi Party, quote, "I am a socialist and a very different kind of socialist from your rich friend Reventlow," end quote. Also in 1930, Hitler declared in a speech, quote, "What is socialism? A Jewish invention to set the German people by the ears," end quote. And in a newspaper article he wrote, quote, "Our adopted term, socialist, has nothing to do with Marxian socialism. Marxism is anti-property. True socialism is not," end quote. From statements such as these, the argument is made that Hitler still wanted socialism, but didn't want the Marxist kind. The problem with this is that it begs the question, what kind of socialism is this, which doesn't collectivize the means of production, doesn't place ownership of the means of production in the hands of the workers, and doesn't abolish capitalism? Such a socialism didn't exist, either before Hitler or during his time. As Nazi Party member Otto Strasser stated explicitly, quote, "If you wish to preserve the capitalist regime, Herr Hitler, you have no right to talk of socialism," end quote. As we have seen previously, the only reason why Hitler's political party became associated with the term socialism is that in its earliest days, it had attempted to appeal to as broad a political base as possible, and thus included some genuine pro-socialists in its ranks, and branded itself with the term in an attempt to appeal to workers and pro-socialists. However, we have seen that the Nazi Party quickly abandoned their pro-socialist proposals as they gained more power, and that by 1930, Hitler was explicitly declaring his intention to retain private property and private capitalism, and to deny the workers a share in the leadership or profits of the companies for which they worked. Some people argued that this new type of socialism was itself the National Socialism after which the Nazi Party itself was named, and that it didn't involve a collectivization of the means of production in the hands of the workers, but a kind of racial collectivization of the means of production in the hands of a specific racial group, namely the German people. But this won't work either, since no such definition of National Socialism existed. We've seen Otto Strasser, member of the Nazi Party, state explicitly that Hitler's policies were not just contradictory to Marxist socialism, they were also, in Strasser's own words, quote, "a flagrant contradiction of the great mission of National Socialism," end quote. A major weakness of the way in which this argument is made is that it never provides any evidence for the existence of this mythical non-Marxian socialism under which collectivization and ownership of the means of production are placed exclusively in the hands of ethnic German workers for racist motives. That simply never happened. Private property and private capitalism were preserved, and ethnic German workers continued to be employed by private capitalists. They were never given collective ownership or control of the means of production. Argument 4. Fascism abolished private property rights and private capitalism. This is one of the most common arguments. I already dealt with this in the previous video, in which I showed that both Mussolini's fascism and Nazi Germany's fascism retained both private property rights and private capitalism. See the video description for a link to the relevant section of the previous video. Conclusion. The two videos in this series have demonstrated that formal and informal commentators contemporary with Mussolini and Hitler identified them as right-wing, fascist, capitalist, and anti-socialist, and that mainstream scholarship ever since, whether written by Marxists or capitalists, has agreed consistently that the Italian and German fascists maintained capitalist economies, were right-wing, were not socialist, and opposed socialism in every form, in particular communism. This has been the scholarly consensus for about a century. Of course, the fact that this conclusion has been drawn by the vast majority of scholars does not prove it is correct. A scholarly consensus is not valuable simply by virtue of its numbers. Rather, it is valuable due to the way it is formed. When the overwhelming majority of scholars across a wide range of academic disciplines, representing a broad spectrum of conflicting political views, comes to an agreement on a matter as a result of repeatedly reading and critiquing each other's analysis of historical events, using and applying the same definitions consistently, we can be certain that this is not a fringe belief resulting from the personal or political bias of a handful of people. In contrast, when only a minority of scholars oppose a particular viewpoint, and almost all of those scholars hold personal beliefs which are antagonistic to that viewpoint, we may reasonably draw the conclusion that their opposition is motivated less by facts than by personal preference. The commentators who argue Hitler was a socialist are overwhelmingly anti-socialist and pro-capitalist, are often right-wing in their values and politics, and often use their own special definitions of economic terms which are not shared by the mainstream scholarly consensus. This does not necessarily mean they are wrong, but it does give us very good reason to suspect that their interpretation of Hitler and the Nazis is not motivated by disinterested objectivity. It is very likely that the reason why their interpretation matches so closely with their personal values and politics is that it is a product of them.